Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening to those who are dialing in from other parts of the world. I'm Sachin Gupta, your host for the panel discussion today, and welcome to the panel. Today, we'll be talking about removing biases in the hiring process, and as we can all understand, it's a very relevant, very current topic, and in my opinion, a very serious problem that needs a lot of discussion, that needs a lot of concerted effort from organizations all across the world, with a conscious approach to actually making a significant impact when it comes to this problem and not just talking about it. And there are various stages of how one can address such a situation. So we have an excellent lineup today, talking about how one can remove biases during the hiring process and what are the various things one should keep in mind while thinking about a diversity and inclusion program at your organization. And at a core level, what really that means, right? Like, we can all talk about the activities that one should be doing, the numbers that one should be tracking, but it is very, very important to understand what the problem really is, what it means, what are I would say, the emotional, personal aspects of something like this, and what one can do at workplace to create a meaningful impact. So without further ado, I'll start by introducing our panel members today. We have Domina McQuaid, a pilot turned recruiter. Domina has been a full cycle recruiter for 8 years and at Microsoft for 4 years. She has recruited for SWEs, TPMs, SREs, content devs, Azure advocates, and non-tech roles, and is currently a lead recruiter for Azure data centers. Welcome to the discussion, Domina. Then we have Carl Narcisse, senior tech recruiter at Slack. Carl has been recruiting for almost 10 plus years now and is currently a senior technical recruiter at Slack, developing and executing hiring strategies for front-end, data quality, and product security. Glad to have you, Carl. Then we have Madison Butler, popularly known as the blue-haired recruiter on social media. Madison has spent over 7 years in the industry and is passionate about building diverse and inclusive cultures that attract and retain talent. She is currently the VP of People and Culture at Sourced Craft Cocktails and COO/Principal Curator for Seapine Advisory. Great to have you on the panel, Madison. And folks, it will be great if you could turn on your video so that the audience can actually put a face to the names. And then finally, we have Alicia Jessup. Alicia is the Inclusion and Diversity Manager at Tech Systems and is impassionate to develop, execute, and manage strategic programs, initiatives, and events in support of Tech Systems' inclusion and diversity strategy that impact both the business and stakeholders, which includes internal employees, consultants, and clients alike. Really excited to have all of you today, guys. Thanks a lot for joining the panel discussion, and I'm looking forward to a very engaging discussion going forward.
Thank you.
So,
thank you.
Yeah. So let's start with the very first question, and this one is for all the panel members. I would like to get each one of your perspective on what do you think about the importance of diversity? What does it mean to you? And in your opinion, what value does it bring at workplace? So maybe we could start with you, Madison.
Sure. So I think for me, obviously, I'm a Black woman, and it is extremely important to me to work for organizations who value me for being a Black woman and all the things I bring to the table because of that, not despite that. And so being valued for my skill set, but also the experiences that I bring without it being a hindrance or people thinking I'm the angry Black woman or all of the stereotypes that kind of get lumped into being a Black woman. In order to have true diversity and true inclusion, those are the things that you have to be able to break down within your organization.
Interesting. So Carl, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, so for me personally, I'm an African-American male. More specifically, I am a Haitian American male. So like my family's from Haiti, my 2 older sisters are from Africa. So we even have like geographic diversity within my family. I lived in different parts of the country and I've recruited for agencies and startups. And so for me, I value diversity both as who I am personally, but also like in my workplaces and like where I'm living and working every day. And so when it comes to that, I value that perspective especially at a place like Slack, because we have a product that's built for knowledge workers all over the world, regardless of domain or location. It's built for knowledge workers all over the world. And so, being a part of a company that actually reflects that in their workforce and not only in their product is paramount for me, just because it's at the essence of who I am as a person.
So Domina, what's your perspective, coming from a large organization like Microsoft, both at the organization and your own perspective to what diversity means?
Sorry, I accidentally almost clicked out. So like others, diversity is really one of my personal values. I grew up primarily raised by my father, who has cerebral palsy. So growing up with a disabled father, just the inclusion and diversity is just always important to me. From a company perspective, I think there's kind of two reasons why it's important, and main reasons, I should say. Number one is just like ethically, morally, it's the right thing to do. And second is it makes business sense. If you're a company and you're trying to build products or services that appeal to everyone, that's a much bigger market share than just targeting your products towards one segment of the population. And so in order to build products and services that work for everyone, your team that's building them needs to be diverse.
Makes absolute sense. Lisi, what's your perspective?
I think for me, it ties in a little personal and professional to just similar to what the panelists have already shared. So personally, just the example that segued and was the catalyst to where I'm now as a business professional starts with my upbringing. That's coming from a very, very small town in the middle of America, Iowa, and constantly being in interactions with a lot of sameness, and from a people standpoint, from a racial standpoint, and then growing on into my career, both personally and professionally, getting interactions and opportunities with diversity, i.e. people and experiences that no longer were similar to where I grew up, elevated and helped impact my perspective as a human being. So then you take that example as an individual and as a person and carry that over, and it's very similar to how organizations work. When we just look at diversity in and of itself as a definition from a statistical standpoint, we also know that the more diverse businesses are, the better that they are from a sense of the products that they're producing, from the metrics that they're hitting, et cetera. So if we can honor that and think through that just from a simple numbers game and from a statistical standpoint, the more diverse and the more emphasis we put on diversity in our organization, the better outcomes we will have. The second then piece, which I think needs to follow, is around the inclusion. And that's okay, while we focus on diversity, what are we doing at the same time in conjunction to ensure that our individuals that have diverse backgrounds are being seeded and planted in a way that they can grow into the organization being their best selves to just contribute and continue to highlight the diversity that they're bringing and that we're encouraging them to join us for.
Fascinating. So, if I were to kind of sum up the responses from all of you, two things kind of stand out. One is it's a no-brainer that as an organization, as you're building products for the world, if you are not the teams inherently are not diverse, then you probably end up building solutions which are specific to a certain subgroup, right? And that's not good for business in purely economical terms. But at a personal level,
Exactly.
each one of us comes from different, we have our own, all of us have our own backstories, right? We grew up in a certain way, in a certain style, in certain places, and if we are not able to, if our employers are not able to relate to that, our co-workers are not able to relate to that, then we'll always feel, for lack of a better word, left out, right? And you spend a third of your day at work, and you want to feel part of a larger group, right? So, and hence having an understanding of where do different people come from, what are the cultures they grew in, what do they like, what do they dislike, at least some understanding of that is essential to create a workplace that's harmonious and emotionally rewarding. So so let's with that, let's move on to the next question, and this one's for you, Carl. What are some tips that recruiters and hiring managers should follow in order to reduce the bias in the recruiting and interviewing process?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, the way I look at it, I think it's really about putting an emphasis on the partnership between recruiting and hiring management. So it's very much like the key to great recruiting and to building a diverse pipeline is around getting hiring leaders, the hiring teams, and recruiting all on the same page. And thinking about like our process. So every single stage of it, where are we potentially promoting bias and how do we go about mitigating that? And so from the very beginning, from the job descriptions, how are we building those? What is the language that we're using? Like how are we, like is the language that we're using more of a fixed mindset? Is it more like aggressive or it's geared more towards a male audience? How do we eliminate some of that language to make sure that we're keeping it inclusive while also keeping our top of funnel fairly large? I think it's also you also have to look at various areas. So like the coding assessments, how are we going about coding? I know I'm speaking from the engineering perspective, so it's kind of, part of the process to have some type of coding challenge or something like that involved to be able to assess skill. So like, how are we building it? Are we building it in a way where we're looking just for computer science theory that's not really tangible to the job? Or are we building it in a way that's actually tangible to the day-to-day work, the scope of work that one would be doing? So thinking of it along that way. Also, like the on-site interviews, like who is interviewing? Like, do we have someone who's like a junior level person interviewing a senior person? That may cause some discrepancies there. How are we developing our panels? Like, I know one thing that we do at Slack is that we have a female that's involved on the on-site panel for every single interview panel, because we want to be able to have that. We want people of color involved on the on-site interview panel. And like when you're building out those questions, and you think about the process, recruiting the hiring manager to the hiring team, what type of questions are we asking? We need to develop like a rubric around what is a good answer and a bad answer, and taking out the whole like me going with my gut. Like my gut is telling me that we should pass on this person. Like you need to eliminate that because that's introducing bias right there. So being able to have like a structured rubric. And that could be for like even like a smaller company, just having like a baseline rubric around like what is a good and a bad answer when it comes to teamwork and collaboration or software architecture. Like being able to really build that out, and I think that's a partnership that's involved there.
Got it. So it looks like there are things that you've kind of put in place, right from reviewing the job descriptions to the kind of assessments that you give to rubrics during the interview. So is that a process? Is there like a specific team at Slack who's responsible for looking at this process, fine-tuning it, measuring it, or is that left to the recruiting teams, each of those pods, to kind of implement on their own?
That is a great question, and the way that I'll answer that is that it's everyone. It's everyone. The onus is not just on one person. The onus is on everyone involved, from like again the hiring leaders to the actual people on the interview team, the hiring teams, to recruiting. It's really is a collective effort that doesn't fall on one particular department or the other. It's very much around like, okay, this is what these are the hiring needs. This is how we're looking to build diversity. Okay, here's the evaluation process which we're going to follow, and that involves everyone. It's a cross-functional, cross-collaborative effort throughout.
Makes a lot of sense. What's your take on this, Domina? Like, what are some of the things that you are doing today in your recruiting process to ensure bias doesn't creep in?
Yeah, I think Carl nailed it. A lot of the same stuff. Just to get a little bit more granular and build off of what he was saying, when it comes to job descriptions, there are certain words that are, masculine or feminine. And statistically, if you're not being intentional about your job descriptions, you're not going to attract diverse candidates in the first place. So that's the number one place that I tell teams to go to. Look at the wording. Make sure you have a good blend of masculine and feminine words. Another thing is we call them like basic qualifications. Is statistically, women will only apply to jobs where they meet 100% of the qualifications, and men, I can't remember the exact statistic, but it's something like 25%. Somebody can fact check me, but make sure that you're like, do you truly need those requirements? Keep them to the bare bones so that you're not shrinking your talent pool size right from the beginning. And then the other thing he said about making the loops look like the person, that reduces bias, right? So if it's a woman or an African-American woman, make sure that you have another person who's African-American Black, and make sure you have at least one other woman on that loop. So not only does it remove bias, but it also increases your chance of landing that candidate, because they want to feel like they're going to fit in. And you know, over the past few years, we've had a competitive market, and candidates have choices. And so if they feel like, you know, they might fit in more at one culture, they're going to pick that culture. Or if they see a leadership team that's diverse and that growth path for themselves, those visuals matter. So everything Carl said, +1.
Lisa, you wanted to add to that?
Can I add to that real quick?
Yeah.
I truly feel, and I've seen this demonstrated throughout like my time at Slack, is that every single stage in the process is a selling opportunity. If I'm a candidate off the street, how are you showing me like the value that I'm able to bring to the organization? And how are you making me feel like I'm included in that organization? So every single step of the way, it's recruiting and the hiring team, everyone who's involved, to be able to essentially, you know, sell the candidate on why this is a great opportunity. So that by the time that you come to the end, the rate of success as far as closing them and having them join is a lot higher, because they've had that warm and fuzzy feeling throughout, and they felt included. They can feel like the company values and the missions throughout that process, to where it's a lot easier of a close. So it's great at attracting talent that way.
Got it. So it's not just about, like like both of you said, it's not just about that it reduces bias or removes bias, but it also helps you land the candidate better, because then they truly feel that the organization is inclusive. Lisa, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I do. And Carl, I absolutely love that point. I think that's actually a really direct call out we should make, especially to any untapped or underrepresented people that are listening to this, is take that confidence and that empowerment when you walk in, step up into organizations and interview them just as much as they're interviewing you, because back to the power being in the people, absolutely. But the question around, you know, what are some things organizations can be doing to remove biases is critical, and right, that's the whole essence of this talk and this panel, but that is a hefty one. And for me, I was thinking about this through the lens of what's been going on within these last few weeks of recent events, and the amount of overwhelming feeling that I've had as an inclusion and diversity practitioner, not only in my organization, but outside of that as well, because I think now more than ever, everybody wants to talk to the diversity manager, everybody has questions, and everybody wants to talk because everybody wants to take action. Everybody's ready for next steps. How do we resolve some of the inequities that we have, some of the social injustices that we have in America, et cetera? Alicia, what can we be doing? And I started to feel overwhelmed. And so unpacking that, I thought, okay, well, where's that coming from? And for me, it was a foundational piece. We were not all on the same foundation of what action meant. And so when I think about this question, what can organizations be doing to remove biases in our organization? We need to take it a step back into the foundation. And it sounds like, Carl, especially from the Slack point of view, you all are pretty along in your diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy from a maturity standpoint, to that you're now at the point where it's everybody's responsibility. I don't think it needs to start with everybody's responsibility to put in the foundation. It needs to be a group of thought leaders that can help identify, and maybe they collect everybody's opinion on, hey, what does diversity mean here at our organization? What does inclusion mean here at our organization? What does equity mean here at our organization? And then take it into the bias scenario, because there are hundreds of biases, right? And not all of them are bad. I mean, biases are important and they're hardwired into us as humans, as species, for a reason, but we want to extract the ones that might be inherently oppressing people or our opportunity to attract and retain groups of people. So let's come to an understanding of what biases foundationally do we want to make sure we are mitigating and reducing through our entire employee engagement life cycle.
That's a very, very important point, Lisa, that you made. If an so if I got it correctly, if as an organization you haven't put these things in place, setting the foundation actually requires a very focused effort by a bunch of people in the organization who would define and answer these critical questions about what diversity, inclusion, and equity means, and then make sure some of those things are codified and put into place. And then, like you said, Carl, eventually it has to become something that everybody owns, right? Otherwise, it will never be fully baked in as part of the culture. Very interesting points. So moving on to the next question, and this one, would like Madison, you to give it a shot. So, what metrics should one keep in mind while creating a diversity hiring strategy? Are there any KPIs that you like to track personally?
So I'm actually pretty unorthodox. I am not big on metrics in regards to people, and I think you end up blurring this like weird sales and recruiting world. And so for me and my team, I actually don't focus on KPIs as much as I focus on finding the right person, and that's on both sides for me. And so kind of like what Carl said, the things that I really focus on are that structured interview process and making sure that when we are asking questions, everyone's getting kind of the same interview instead of you go in and you see me, so you say, oh my God, I'm so surprised by how articulate you are. But then you interview a straight white guy and you're like, completely different. So for me, it's more of a focus on the actual hiring managers and them being self-aware around inclusion and diversity versus being like, I need you to interview at least 10 Black women. That feels icky to me because as a Black woman, I don't ever want to be picked off of LinkedIn because I look Black.
Right.
It doesn't sit right with me. And so I try to kind of instill that in my teams as well.
Very interesting point. And I was actually relating to this even in the previous responses. So it's not really about diversity inclusion. It's not really about saying, hey, we need 10 people of color, 5 female engineers. It's not about those numbers. It's actually about eliminating the biases that today exist that probably make your process more favorable for a certain subgroup, right? So it's all about leveling the playing field. And then naturally, if your top of the funnel is diverse enough, the right candidates would go through. So it's about the right candidate and inclusive rather than having focus on specific groups. That's very interesting. Lizzie, what do you want to add to that?
That is, okay, that pretty much sums it up, Sachin. You're a very great active listener. I'm so happy that you are moderating this panel, because that to me is the key phrase. It's leveling the playing field. And I love Madison, first of all, because she's LinkedIn famous, and I've been following her long before we sat on this panel together. But her and I have a little bit of a difference in this thought philosophy as it relates to the metrics component. While I definitely honor and respect the example that she just shared of no way do I want to be picked from LinkedIn just due to the color of my skin or the background, the leveling the playing field is the key component here. Because again, in my humble opinion, when I'm talking about diversity, when I'm talking about inclusion, the nucleus to me for that is equity. And sometimes it does take metrics to make sure we're leveling out the playing field, because if we lead with, hey, you know what, don't worry about the numbers, don't worry about the metrics, then we might step into the arena of, okay, then let's just make sure it's all equal. And our current tech sector and our current tech makeup is not equal. So we do have to have some uneven, some specific numbers being catered to one thing to help remove barriers in our bias. The whole theme of removing biases should not be the end. It's a means to an end. It is the point we can take to help remove and eliminate some of the inequities that we have in tech. So when I think about metrics, maybe to Madison's point, let's not put the burden of the metrics on the people that are already underrepresented and already untapped, but let's for sure put some metrics and the onus back into our entire system and the processes that live in our system. So maybe it's, hey, can we track diversity data on all of our applicants that are walking through our door? And then can we measure and see how different demographics are falling off or being continued all the way to offer acceptance in our entire life cycle of employee engagement? Can we measure and share results around our hiring managers and our teams and the people that they're having sit down in their team's chairs and look at some of the data and demographics there? And then can we measure and reward what's getting done or acknowledge what's not getting done? Can we put in metrics? Can we get some sort of system in place to be able to measure interview feedback from all candidates and start to get some exposure and start to get some communication, some awareness around our biases and some of the demographics that are or are not getting hired or offers into our organization? Yeah, I think those are some examples of where metrics are actually important, but to Madison's point, shape it a little bit and don't put it back into the already underrepresented that you're trying to consider in your organization.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful. Go ahead, Madison.
No, I was gonna say, I think it's also really important to really start diving into the conversations you're having with your hiring managers. I know I've had hiring managers who have declined candidates of color without really kind of being able to give me a reason. And so being willing to dive into what that reason is, because so much of unpacking our biases is the ability to be self-aware. And sometimes you have to have someone else call it out for you. And I think sometimes it's a really hard conversation to have because so much of it is based in, well, I feel like you did this thing. But when I can turn around and say, you know, you passed on the last 5 Black women you interviewed, those are the kind of metrics that I'm more interested in, because then I can actually come to you with data like, why did you pass on these 5 Black women? What about them was it? And so, for an example, I had a conversation. He was like, well, they weren't smart enough. And so that said to me that he kind of had a bias towards either women or Black women in general that we really needed to unpack before I could let him continue to interview people who look like me and kind of force that experience on them.
Yeah. So, very, very relevant, and I wouldn't say contrasting, but complementing perspectives, from you, Madison, and MVC. Like they say, what is not measured doesn't improve, right? So there has to be some level of measurement in terms of our overall practices that we put in place. How are we really doing on those numbers broadly? But to your point, Madison, it should not be that, hey, for this team we need 2 people of color or 2 women. That becomes restrictive, right? But at an overall organization level, you need to see, are diverse candidates really going through the interview process? We could understand that, a couple of candidates were not good, but a majority of them are not getting through, then there's definitely some kind of unconscious bias. So the way we would measure our overall recruiting process, I think there is a need to insert a flavor of diversity and inclusion into that and see how some of those metrics pan out against that. And then, very, very insightful conversation so far. So you moving on to the next question. And this, let's go with you, Carl. How do you help hiring managers see the importance of removing or moving information that could lead to biased decisions in the hiring process? And I'm talking specifically about certain data points. Maybe it could be school, it could be where you worked in the past. Of course, some of the PII information like gender and race and ethnicity makes some sense. So, A, what are the practices you follow? And B, what's been your discussion with the hiring managers along these lines?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think when it comes to removing information, it's good to do that like in the very beginning of the process when the recruiter and the hiring manager are talking about the role and like the job profile and being able to kind of work through that mental exercise. So maybe you do remove name and schooling information and just looking, okay, on paper, how does this person look, and seeing like what their thoughts are and pulling up something that's of comparison to that and seeing like where the biases may be. And then from there, kind of doing the before and after. I think it's just a good mental exercise for them to think about, as well as like the hiring teams, like who are the main people we're going to be interviewing, for them to see like, okay, this is the type of profile that we're looking for, and this is where we're seeing, this is where we're in alignment, this is where bias may be introduced, and like really calling it out from the get-go, versus like kind of doing it in the middle of the process when you have a candidate that's in between stages and you're trying to figure it out. Do it up front and like try to strip out as much of the bias as possible. I think personally speaking, for me, like I mean, you can remove the information. I like to confront it head on and be like, this is the information, and this is the reason why I'm presenting you with this candidate. These are, you're telling me that this is the job profile that you have, and this is what this person is bringing to the table, and then here's where it is aligned. So I think as like, I know there's a lot of talent people, recruiting people on this line. I think you have to feel empowered and be bold enough to push back on your hiring managers and those hiring teams. This is your job, is not just like to push paper from one desk to another, but to advise and to provide recommendations to the business. Because this is like, I think it's important, like when you're looking at diversity, it's like turning it not into a diversity problem, but into a business problem.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what it is. Like diversity is not like a pipeline problem. This is a business problem. And so how do we get aligned on that front to where we're able to achieve these goals? And for me, like I present it, as clear as day, this is this person compared with another person on balance. What are we missing here? How do we iterate? How do we build out processes so that person A and person B have equal chance of making it through the process to achieve those business goals?
So you would like to take the bolder approach of actually putting that up front and say, hey, now tell me why this person won't cut the bill.
Yep.
Yeah.
Similar to, it's a microcosm of what's going on in our society today. Like, we need to just call it out and let's recognize our biases for what they are. Straightforward. Okay, now we understand that. Okay, what can we do to mitigate that? So that's my personal approach, and I think you're able to build credibility as a talent professional and with the team by doing that.
Lizzie, what's your take? Like, you obviously take care of the diversity and inclusion program as an overall. So is this something that you would like to put in as a process, saying no PII, at least in the top of the funnel?
Yeah, well, first of all, go off, Carl. Could you imagine being that hiring manager that did not have a great response to his question of, help me understand how you created equitable opportunity for both of these candidates here, hitting it straight on. Love that for you, Carl. I think too, the question of what can we be doing regarding some of this, I think, again, starting it back just a little bit in the sense of, okay, well, let's look at the numbers in terms of the clients the candidates that we're able to reach right now, and where some biases might be within that, or representation might be within that. I just would simply go back to, okay, well, let's look at your output. Let's look at who we have showing up to our interviews. Let's look at who we have showing up to our submittal stages, to our offer stages, what have you. And if there's a common theme of lack of diversity, that to me is the pain point for a greater conversation. So then I take it a step back to that and think, all right, what am I doing from a communication standpoint as it relates to either my job descriptions or just getting the word out around we're hiring? And that comes from a podcast that I listen to. It's called Rework Inclusion and Diversity, Rework Diversity and Inclusion. And they brought up this theme of inclusive communication over accessible communication. Inclusive communication is just ensuring overall tone, content, and message will resonate with all groups. But then accessible communication is ensuring all different groups can access what you're saying, the method of how we are getting out and drawing out the awareness. So that can come in job descriptions. I think a point was brought up earlier by Domina and just gender decoding some of our job descriptions. There are free resources out there that will gender code your job descriptions for you. There is language that we need to be mindful of and just inclusive and make sure that that's inclusive in general. I was reading an article, I think the organization's called Buffer. I'm not super familiar with them, but they were showing their tech organization how when they had the word hacker thrown around all in their job description, only 2% of their candidate pool for developers were women. The rest were, of course, were men. But then once they removed it, it exponentially heightened the gender diversity of applicants just because of the inclusive nature of the language that they were using. So I think there needs to be a conversation on the inclusiveness of the communication, but then the accessibility. It's inclusive, but how are we making sure it's not accessible?
Got it. So moving on to you, Madison, you obviously have a LinkedIn brand, and we've kind of discussed that in the panel, and people love you for that. How do you, extending that to an organization, how does an organization create a brand that attracts diverse candidates?
So I think part of it is being really honest and transparent with your candidates. So for me, obviously, I have my own brand, and I think typically wherever I work kind of gets linked to my brand because I'm pretty loud. And so if they've hired me, they know I'm loud. But I think in general, it's just, I really like it to be organic. I really hate what kind of happened with the Black Lives Matter movement, and everything just became like this weird Black Lives Matter brand push. And so I think honestly, your best marketing is going to be the people that actually work for you when they talk about you organically. I love talent branding. However, I do think sometimes it takes this weird, again, kind of yucky turn where you've turned inclusion and diversity into a PR push. So for me, I feel like creating that brand is really creating an environment where people are excited to talk about you, to talk about being there, to want to refer their friends. We all know that the best way to get great candidates and kind of avoid risk is getting referrals. And so when you have people who are genuinely excited to be at your organization, chances are they're going to talk about it, especially with the way LinkedIn is kind of blown up.
So, very relevant point that people should genuinely feel excited about working at the organization, and they are your best vehicles for taking the brand out. But speaking from personal experience, even at HackerEarth, we've had people who really enjoy working at the organization, but they may not necessarily be inherently social, right? Not everybody talks about, they might be happy, but they don't talk about it all the time. So are there things that, and it's not really necessarily that we are trying to sell it, but are there small little things that one could do to kind of support them, nudge them, and get them to be more open on say the social media?
For sure. And I think so that, again, because I like it to be organic, it's hard to push people who aren't necessarily social, but something that we do is we do like an employee spotlight for those people. So people who are really excited to be here, but may not really love the internet, we do like a spotlight piece on them that we share on our LinkedIn and on our blog site. So we can really get their thoughts about them as a person, but also why they like being here, what they do here. And so you still create that same story without kind of forcing their hand to do something that would maybe feel inauthentic to them.
Got it. So what's your take on this, Domina? Microsoft is a large organization and there is a brand that already exists, right? So now how do you try and weave in smaller brands within that larger brand? What's been your strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Madison where, how you market yourself and brand yourself externally, like everything that's external facing, it's important to have like the diversity lens. But I think that what she said is you have to actually have the good environment there for people to want to work there and to stay. And so one thing that I'm really passionate about is just diversity in the people manager and above. Like your leadership team has to be diverse is one thing that I focus on, because I think it helps retain the workforce, it removes bias, and it'll attract more talent. Just Madison put it nicely. So I agree.
Got it. So with that, kind of continuing on the same point, you said that the leadership team needs to be diverse, and that becomes a very strong selling point. Now, have there been instances for you in the past when you had to change a certain process to be more inclusive and diverse, but you had to sell that to your hiring managers or your leadership team? And it's human nature to have resistance to change, right? So how have you dealt with that in the past?
Good question. When it comes to diversity in conversations with whether it's a hiring manager or a CVP, I try to take like a step back and really make sure they understand the why. And I try to customize it because it's not going to be the same for everyone. And I attack it from like the moral standpoint, but also the business case. I customize it. Like I was a recruiter for e-commerce for a long time. And so what I used for some of the leaders there is, hey, statistically more women shop online than men. So if you don't have a lot of women in your engineering team that's building our e-commerce site, it might not appeal to like the biggest shoppers. So you try to customize it to that business group and why it's important. There's some good business cases that have already been mentioned about why diverse teams are better that you can use too. But I think if you can really customize it to what their goals are, it usually lands a little bit better.
Very relevant point. Like I think this has been a recurring theme in the last few responses, that it's not a diversity problem only. In fact, it's a larger business problem, and if that's how you kind of lead all your discussions and all your strategies with, you are more likely to create a positive impact. So Carl, would you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I love the idea of organically recruiting. I think that's the best way to do it. It feels natural for everyone involved versus, I mean, every company, or most companies rather, I should say, have like employment branding around that. And that's definitely important in terms of getting visibility. But like you can organically recruit like through your team, who are the people that you know in your network, who are the people that they know in their networks, what are the different meetups that we can host in order to build community here. That's great career development for those potential people who are part of the meetup, like, hey, you're driving the culture of our company, and you're a part of that. I think there's a lot of camaraderie and community that can be built from that. So I like the idea of organically recruiting as much as you can. It's kind of like the more guerrilla way of finding attracting folks towards your company and building that workforce on top of the employment branding that you're doing. So I think it's very complementary.
So changing gears a little bit, one of the current changes in the work, the way we do work is things are remote, for good or bad, and they're not going to go back to what used to be the normal 3-4 months back anytime soon. And we've spoken about diversity and inclusion. And I think one of the things that has come out is inclusion is an equally important thing, because you got to make sure that once diverse candidates are in the system, they actually grow, they are able to do good work, right? So what's your take, Madison, with respect to remote work on one side and then creating inclusive work environment? Do you think it's going to become harder, or it's going to be easier for us to do that going forward?
So I actually think in regards to inclusion, remote work has made it a little bit harder. One, because it's hard to feel included when you are no longer in an office with people and you're onboarding and you're trying to feel like you're ingrained in this culture, but you've never even seen really the inside of the office. But I think we're also now in this weird world where work and home has really been kind of blurred together into like one blob. And so I think there's this piece where people are really getting praised for the amount of work they do when they're putting in a 14-hour day, without thinking of the fact that inherently not everyone can do that. Some people have children, parents, and different things that they have to take care of in their lives. And being a caretaker or a parent are completely things that fall into the realm of diversity. And so I think it's really hard to help people draw those lines, instead of being like, I feel like I'm working harder and better because I'm working 14 hours a day, but having a manager that really tells you like, it's okay to just work 8 hours, and it doesn't mean you're better or worse than the person who put in a 12-hour day. On the flip side, we're all required to be on Zoom all of the time, and not all of us fall into the same socioeconomic categories. And I have a huge issue with everyone being required to be on Zoom, because we're now showing everyone the inside of our homes. And I think you inherently make people feel bad when you're looking at their house and it may be way nicer than yours, or maybe you didn't clean up and do your laundry today, or do your hair, or your kids are running around in the background. I think you put people in really uncomfortable situations where they now become embarrassed of who they are outside of work, because they now have to bring it to work.
Yeah, that's I completely agree with you, and I think all of us would empathize with that bringing work to our home space, is kind of invading, for lack of a better word, into our personal environments, and people could be judgmental. So it actually makes the problem harder. Lizzie, what's your take from a overall diversity and inclusion program perspective? How do you think remote work, how can one create more inclusive environment given the current scenario of remote work?
Just to comment on a couple of things there, I think another theme here that I'm picking up on is the leadership stake in setting the tone in all of this, and it should be up to the leaders to make sure we're emphasizing that, hey, it's not up to the individual contributors to now make home fit into work. It's how do we make sure work fits into home, and however that shows up. And then, just to quick point out, I don't have kids or a partner or other things, and I definitely still don't want to work a 14-hour work week. So if that's being encouraged, we should all have side conversations to touch on that, because a girl has a life. So thinking about the question around inclusiveness and how that can be promoted, let's start with the greater theme of just this whole panel, back to the biases, and where I see now this starting to get projected in our current remote state, quarantine, COVID-19, whatever, is I could see now bias is starting to seep in around similarity bias, and like, hey, I just really kick it with Madison. We've got a lot in common. Now when I'm doing my remote work and I've got those little breaks, I want to talk to Madison probably over somebody else on my team because of some of the similarities that we have. Or, hey, Carl actually is in my neighborhood, and I know that he likes to do this. So now we've got some proximity bias probably at play here. So I would say, when I can think about inclusivity being promoted and how leaders can make sure that they're charging with that, or just allies that are passionate about inclusion and diversity in their spaces, is we need to be really, really encouraging, or set up specific time to make sure that we are building relationships and engaging with one another that might not always be happening. And one thing that one of my teammates did just in my local office that I loved was she did, I don't know what site she used, but it was free, a free tool where you could put in everybody's names on the team and it would match you up. And now it was dependent on those two to go out and do like a virtual coffee or do like a little virtual hangout with each other, because that's building relationships. And that is going to resolve all of this, the heart and the human connection that we have as it relates to diversity and inclusion. So just one little example like that sets the tone that will start to disseminate some of the biases that are going to ultimately fester up in this new working environment that we're engaged in. So I think that just starts with being authentic and getting to know your people and building relationships first and letting that be the strength that you work off of, and then focus on the product second.
Got it. So, very relevant, very interesting perspective. So if I were to kind of summarize it, because we are not at offices anymore, those water cooler conversations are not happening. It's actually become a little harder to connect with people. Hence, we have to be more intentional about connecting with all our peers and creating those relationships. Very, very relevant point. So moving on to biases, DC, you talked about bias, and you brought up some interesting biases like proximity bias and affinity bias. So Carl, in your experience, are there any specific biases that you've seen to be most rampant when it comes to tech recruiting?
I think one that sticks out to me is just the idea of groupthink. When it comes like to the on-site stage, like, okay, we've interviewed this candidate. Okay, now let's all meet in a room and talk about the candidate and the feedback. Like, that's where I think that there's a lot of false negatives that happen there, where it's like everyone's going around the room. Yes, I like this person. They did well on this and that, but they didn't do well on, I feel like that's another thing. Is like, I feel like they didn't quite answer this question, or there was something about the way they answered about like software architecture that didn't land with me. Well, like, why is that? It's like calling that out immediately. And like, once that kind of like one person starts talking, then everyone's like, oh, well, I noticed this thing too. And the group thing just kind of, permeates throughout the room to where like the decision is a no. When that person is probably a false negative and probably fits in well, but like the biases have crept in and now it's too late. So like, that's why, like, to Maz's point and to everyone else's point, like being able to build like a structured type of way of understanding, like, okay, how are we assessing candidates? And it doesn't have to be like, if you're a smaller like startup company, like it doesn't have to be something like super granular and robust, but you have to show some intention there. If you're like a 5-person startup, you want to be able to have like some baseline understanding as far as like, what are we doing to be being able to eliminate groupthink? If you're a bigger company, okay, this is the rubrics that we have in place. This is how we're assessing it. I've looped in management and our human resource business partners in terms of like, these are the questions that we're asking. You can reach out to various resources to help you mitigate that. But I see like the groupthink, at various companies, like, okay, we're all in a room. What do we all think? Oh, well, I'm leaning more toward, I like them, but I'm leaning more towards no, because it doesn't resonate with what I feel is right. And getting rid of the gut feeling altogether, I think is one of the major ways to eliminate that.
So to kind of address that, would you recommend not having such, I would say, group discussion post the candidate and getting everyone to first put in their feedback in isolation and then kind of discussing about it together?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we do at Slack is like, we have this SLA, like, where between 24 to 40 hours after the on-site interview, you must put in all your feedback. And if you don't, I likely will hunt you down for the feedback. But yeah, we want everyone to be able to have that. And the way that like our systems are set up is that you can't see anyone's feedback until you submit your own. Gotcha. So being able to eliminate that, we want to be able to eliminate time. So like, if you fill out your feedback 5 days later, you probably already forgotten some of those really rich details that will be helpful in assessing. So being able to have a short timeline on when you present the feedback is crucial. One thing that's kind of happened with us, I'm just giving you like a personal anecdote at Slack, is like, we used to have our own kind of roundtables. We've graduated away from that just because of like just issues of scale. We can't get everyone in the same room all the time when we're interviewing all these candidates. And so what we have is that we have the hiring manager being able to look at the feedback. So submit your feedback on time, the hiring manager looks at it and is able to make a judgment call without the group thing entering in. And they have all the proper rubric and process in place to be able to make an informed decision.
Got it. Domina, what's been your experience? Any specific bias that stands out? for you?
Yeah, this maybe isn't the biggest one, but it's been one that's been top of mind for me lately. I think that referrals are biased, and referrals are a great source for candidates because you have lots of data points on them, and statistically they do well. But I think if you have a team that's a bunch of white males, their referrals are probably going to be a bunch of white males. And so you have to, so it's been running through my mind a lot you have to be intentional to level that playing field. And so, if you're getting a lot of referrals, they're all the same, then be intentional on LinkedIn and self-source them so that your slate of candidates is diverse. So that's just one that's been top of mind for me lately.
Interesting. Go ahead, Lizzie.
I love that. And I think that kind of goes back to the bigger conversation we were having earlier around metrics. And personally speaking, I'm okay with that type of metric because that to me is being equitable. And I think somebody asked that in the audience, like, what does equity mean to all of you? That to me is being intentional with how you're going about sourcing and identifying candidates. And I wouldn't be super upset, I guess, to change my thought earlier if somebody consistently was reaching out to me because of my demographic. That to me is a form of reparations in the tech sector that's giving me opportunities that I may not have had access to before. So I'll be the one to say, no, thank you. I'm okay with this opportunity. Or actually, yes, okay, let's explore it. I love the fact that especially you, Domina, as a recruiter in your role, have so much power and capability to make sure that, again, back to the communication, I was not only being inclusive, but accessible.
Got it. So, the next one is kind of a sticky one. So we always talk about bias being unconscious, but is bias really unconscious? Is there, is it possible that there is a conscious bias going on when people make decisions to employ people who they think fit into their culture? And there's been a lot of talk about culture fit. Trying to hire people who are similar to them, and there is some merit to that argument, right? So what's your so how do we kind of tackle something like that when we consciously as an organization say that, hey, we want to hire people who fit in? Madison, what's your perspective about something like this?
I hate nothing more than the words culture fit. I talk about it a lot. And it's because we shouldn't be looking for people to fit in. That's not how you create a diverse culture. You should be creating a team that allows people to come in and take space. I should be able to come in as exactly who I am without feeling like I have to fit in and want to drink kombucha and your beer on tap and all of this stuff. And so, we do not say culture fit anywhere in my company. Because when I think about why I want to bring people onto my team, it's about the value they add, not about how they fit into my culture. And I think we all get caught up in this whole sentiment that we have to hire people we like, and we don't have to hire people that we want to hang out with and we want to get beer with. If I only hire people that I want to hang out with, we probably have a problem because they're probably pretty similar to myself. And so when you think about culture fit, that's exactly what it is. People that you want to go grab a beer with, people you want to go grab lunch with. And it's okay to hire people who are exactly your polar opposite because they will bring a different perspective than you. So when it comes to culture fit, I actually think we just use it to inherently hide bias. And so I do a lot of work with sales teams. They use culture fit a lot. And it usually is they're not the right culture fit. And what that meant was that person's too old, they're a woman, they're too brown, they're queer. And I think we use it as the legal way to basically say, I wouldn't work with them because of this thing that they are.
Right. So, that is at some level, firstly, I would like to say that, it's really nice to see that you kind of oppose that, and in the organization, you're talking about it so vocally. But, at some level, it's scary, right? It requires a level of strength to say, okay, I am okay to hire people who are different from me, and not, in terms of gender, race, otherwise, but, the personality type, because now you'll have to work with a person who you may not naturally be able to speak with very comfortably, right? So it makes you uncomfortable. And I think that's something that we are kind of constantly fighting against. But Carl, switching, going over to you as well, culture is something that a lot of organizations are proud about, right? They very proudly talk about, hey, this is our culture. So and culture in some sense is an identity of the organization. So how do you maintain or create that identity while still making sure you're adding enough different people that the culture actually grows?
Yeah, great question. Every company has their own type of culture. It just varies, big, small, whatever the case may be. And you have your own kind of company values that are, I guess, the thesis for how you work and how you're, driving value with the product and service that you're offering. And so that's kind of already embedded. I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind when you're building out your processes and you're attracting talents to your company, but then also being able to challenge at the same time. That's where the growth happens in terms of your own company growth, and then internally in terms of how you're viewing talent and what it may look like or the type of skills that they're bringing to the table. So I think it's important to, when you're working with folks that are doing the hiring, especially as a recruiting and talent person, being able to kind of challenge that status quo and seeing, okay, what type of different perspective can this person bring to the table? And I feel like as like a talent and recruiting person, professional, like there's a little spidey sense, like when you're talking to candidates, you're going through like your formulaic set of questions, right? But then like, like this person has like this extra X factor or superpower that they're bringing to the table. Like ask those questions and then present that data to the hiring team or the folks that are involved in the hiring decision process. Like there's a part of it where it's just like, okay, we know this person has X skills, but they have like this Y variable involved. And this is how this Y variable can actually challenge the status quo and the DNA that we already have and actually bring more value and help us grow as a team and as a company because of it. So embrace like what that is and talk with them talk with like the hiring team in terms of like their team dynamics and how they're building their teams and like what this candidate could bring to the table. Again, it's a part about like people within recruiting and folks in general should feel empowered and emboldened to be able to have that conversation.
Interesting. So do you think that the onus to kind of bring out that X factor in those candidates lie today with the recruiting team today?
I think it's on recruiting. Again, I think it's on everyone. But like for recruiters who are like the gatekeepers of the company and you're the first one talking to people, like this is your chance to extract that data. And also like as advisors to the business, like to tactfully push back and challenge the status quo. And like, this is what this person's going to be able to bring to your organization. And I think it's important to like, if you're working with an organization or department, look at where their inefficiencies are. How does this potential candidate that I have address those inefficiencies so that you can grow? So again, tying into being a business problem.
Got it. Lizzie, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think I just want to try to combine some of the parallels that I'm hearing between Madison and Carl. But first, to just go off the question you just asked, Sachin, around, is that on us to extract that X factor from a potential candidate? I would say personally, no, because my job is to set the framework and make sure that the best picture is painted and adequately painted. But as far as extracting anything from a candidate, that just seems like a lot of emotional energy that I am not getting paid nearly enough to do. So I'm not going to extract anything for anybody because that's not my role. When I think about the culture piece though, and how to really harbor that, I love what Madison was initially saying around, I hate the term culture fit. So let's unpack that for a second and why that might create some of that just icky feeling that we have, because it sounds like there's some themes. And I think Carl was starting some of that unpacking. But for me, it starts back with the question should be, okay, well, what are we trying to achieve here? And is this the best person equipped to support that? And then here's the thing though, with Madison and then Carl's point is at the end of the day though, there is such thing as culture, right? There's culture as individuals and there's cultures as groups and there's cultures in our systemic organizations in which we're all operating with. So I want to know those definitions as either the person that's supporting these hiring initiatives or a person on the team that's looking to bring on said talent. What does that mean to me? And then how does that integrate into the team whose culture I'm a part of, and then into my greater organization? So back to the biases that we're also talking about, similarity bias, groupthink, homogeneous settings are oftentimes dependent because the inputs are constantly repeated. So then the representations and the numbers aren't getting changed in terms of who we're hiring and whose resumes we're looking at, right? But more often than not, I think culture is set and then the excuse of, well, they're not a culture fit is put on because that team is having a hard time in their culture being able to handle disruption and the debate. And that to me is a recipe for a business disaster. The best teams I know have no problem debating, have no problem challenging or bringing forth opposing ideas. That's diversity of thought. And diversity of thought, disagreements, varied perspectives, inherently challenging individuals, teams, and organizations and products for the better. That's the whole idea of when I say culture is important, and I think it's important to have an established understanding of what that means for us as individuals all the way up into the organization and how it intertwines. But when I hear the thought of, oh, someone's not a culture fit, or there's not really a great understanding of what culture means for our group, I want to unpack that. And it's usually this insecurity of, oh, this person challenges me in a way that I can't quite comprehend, and I don't know if I'm cool with that.
Got it. So, absolutely the point, it makes sense that, people try to hide behind culture fit when they're not able to handle, like you said, disruption. And disruption is important, right? Unless you are able to think differently, how you're going to come up with different ideas and go along different paths. So, but playing devil's advocate a little bit, Domina, this is to you. If the person checks off on the skill sets, is culture fit necessarily a bad thing?
It's a red flag to me. I fucking hate that term. And sorry to use making it PG-13 here, but it's a flag. It's bias. Every time I hear it, I typically approach it in a less aggressive way so that people aren't defensive. And so I just ask a question. What do you mean by that? What does that even mean? First of all. So I make them explain and usually squirm a little bit. And but usually it leads to a good conversation. And so like what I ultimately do is I explain why I don't like that term, for all the reasons everyone else already stated. And then the term that I like better, I don't know where I picked this up from, but I like when people say culture add, because you're really not trying to get someone to conform to your culture. You're trying to get someone who adds to your culture, who brings new perspectives, new ideas. So always replace culture fit with culture add is my personal opinion.
Very interesting perspective.
I like that.
Go ahead.
Just real quick on that, Sachin, because even your comment to Domina on playing the devil's advocate around, well, what if this person meets all the skill sets? That to me begs a greater conversation and question lining of, well, why are we always hiring for specific skill sets? To Domina's point, let's hire for the culture add. Let's recruit for potential. If our whole goal is to evolve as a business, then don't we want to identify somebody that can help us evolve, even if it makes us a little uncomfortable at first?
Very interesting perspective, Lizzie and Domina, because I was actually expecting a response saying, no, if the person meets the quality benchmark, it's okay. But I see a different perspective that says we should intentionally be adding to the culture, and if someone really fits in very well, that's actually a red flag. So very, very interesting perspective.
Can I add to that? And that was just going back to like my previous response around like spidey sense and gathering that information. I don't mean for it to be like an emotionally laborious type of exercise, but rather like, okay, you're going through your questions. Okay, how is this person working in various teams? How are they able to learn from their mistakes and be a better teammate? How are they able to add to our culture? And so like you're picking up on things, you're going through your set of questions, but then like there are like these follow-ups. I think these are important follow-ups and information to see how they can be a culture add.
Gotcha.
Sorry, one more thing. I promise it's my last comment on this. I heard a great speaker last week, and she said that we need to shift the thinking of, I want to hire a great software engineer who happens to be Black. I want to hire, what we should be thinking is, I want to hire them because they're a great Black engineer. So again, to that culture adding new perspectives.
Got it. Very, very, very interesting, like I said, and feel free to chip in, guys. I mean, like the more perspectives we bring onto the discussion, the better it's for the audience. So changing the track a little bit, we've been talking about diversity, inclusion, biases. When it comes to early talent hiring, do you see things? Do you see biases in general being, being different? Are there different kind of bias challenges we are facing when we are doing early talent hiring? Carl, any perspective on that? How do you run a bias-free process specifically for early talent hiring?
Great question. I mean, there's biases of all types. I mean, obviously race, ethnic orientation. There's also geographic bias. I'm in San Francisco, but this person's in New York. Can I really move to San Francisco and do this job? Maybe not. So I'm going to, cut them off. That's a bias right there. I mean, they come in so many forms. I think, for folks in the recruiting industry, like we see it all because we see resumes and we see people that are coming through. So you could be like bias that's right in front of you, or it could be bias that's on paper and what they look like and where they've worked at before. So, I mean, the best way that I've personally seen it is like the way where it's kind of you're doing like behavioral interviewing. Like, so like, for example, like at Slack, we do a lot of behavioral interviewing on the engineering side. So it's not like about like just theory, but it's more about like, how do you work? Like we're essentially trying to figure out, can you do the work and can you work with other humans? That's essentially the question that we're trying to figure out. It's like IQ and EQ mixed together, and we want to be able to know that through your experiences. How are you, tell me about like the various good, bad, and ugly situations that you go through. How are you able to learn from those? How are you able to build a product? Things of that nature. How are you able to deal with, I guess, disagreements on your team and learn from those experiences? And so I think being able to build out like an early talent hiring process that addresses that, to understand, especially when you're early on, and every hire matters, is like understanding, okay, can you do the work and can you work with other humans? Tell me the good and bad, ugly of all of those different things and what you're able to learn, to be able to become a mature engineer or a mature business person within our company.
So a follow-up on that, and I may be wrong on this, but typically early in your career, you've not been exposed to work environments, right? So you haven't, well, you've had human interactions while doing your projects in school maybe, but not really those work environment related interactions. So have you seen early, folks who are early in their career be able to actually answer that in a manner that gives you a sense of whether this person will be able to work with other people? Like, have they even been exposed enough to have that kind of EQ?
I would say so. I mean, you bring up the idea of like different projects within college. Those are great examples. How were you able to work with your classmates in order to work on this deadline, so to speak, for this project? It's essentially like a business type of question. How are you handling it? What are some of the obstacles you had to go through? What did you learn from that situation? And so you could see the maturity and the growth of that person and how that fits within your organization. Like those are the traits that you want. Hopefully they're positive traits that you want to be able to bring into your organization. So it could be, yeah, class projects. It could be organizations that you're a part of that show leadership qualities, whatever the case may be. There's definitely a lot of great data within that.
So, would love to get your comments on when it comes to early talent hiring. Are there specific things that you put in place to remove bias?
Yeah, honestly, everything Carl shared is spot on. And I think the biggest message to emphasize to anybody that might be listening that's in a capacity where they're recruiting or making decisions on hiring is you take those list of questions and you keep them the same for every single interview, because that will then help you all understand some data points on where some of those biases might be happening in the first place. So I think that's like a really important thing to call out. And I had another thought, but I lost it. So if it comes back, I'll do that.
Thank you, Alicia, for that. Yes, it's important to almost standardize it across. So like for you, if you're recruiting your talent, you're able to compare and contrast. Why do we pick candidate A when candidate B had the same type of signal and data? There you go, you're calling it out, and that needs to be called out, and so that the data and all the information is consistent throughout for you to make that informed decision and to, properly call it out.
Got it.
Calling out, all 2020, just calling out. It's time.
Right. So, Domina, this is to you. Are there some creative ways to source and hire candidates from, let's say, underrepresented communities? And this is more on the sourcing side. Have you done something different to increase the talent pool there?
Yeah, like I said before, I'm very intentional about it. Like every business I've ever worked for, they know that every slate for every role is going to have diversity. And so when I'm sourcing, I'm intentional about it. There's certain search strings with keywords that will pull, depending on what kind of diversity you're looking for. There's geographic, you can, certain areas are more diverse than others. There's colleges, historically Black colleges you can recruit from. LinkedIn has a function that I've started playing around with, the filter function, where you can put a ton of things, like you can put like 1,000 names in there. So I've seen some recruiters where they'll, target certain names even. So you can, if you're intentional about it, it's the talent's there. And if the hiring manager is being too narrow focused, like they have too many requirements, you figure out which ones they can flex on to widen that talent pool. So yeah,
Got it.
I think.
Okay, so I'm going to throw in a term here, and whoever wants to chip in and respond to that, please do. There's been talk about blind hiring over the years, and I've seen perspectives on both sides. Anyone wants to talk about what do you think your perspective is when it comes specifically to blind hiring? Some people even take it to the extent saying, if the interview, if I could potentially not see, and this could happen in a remote hiring environment where I don't see who the candidate is, and if there is some level of voice depersonalization that I could do, then I really don't know who's the person on the other side, and I could and I would really be assessing them on the role that's out there. So that is like taking it to an extreme level. The a smaller aspect of that would be, like we discussed, removing personally identifiable information, at least from the resume, or at least the top of the funnel. So perspectives on blind hiring, do you guys follow it? Anybody wants to take that?
So I guess I have issues with blind hiring for the reason, if you feel like you have to do blind hiring in order to get a diverse candidate hired, I have some serious questions about that manager being able to equitably manage a diverse candidate. So, because eventually, yes, maybe it mitigates the bias in the interview process, but what happens once they're employed here? That manager still has the bias. You have to fix the bias. Like, no matter what we do or magic we do, like, it doesn't actually fix anything. We have to fix human problems with human solutions.
Speak on it. Yeah.
Go ahead, Lisa.
I just think, again, that to me puts the ownership back on the candidate, especially if that candidate's underrepresented again. Because here's the thing, and I hope this is being clear for anybody that's listening right now, is that biases aren't inherently a bad thing. We all have them. We use them to drive and operate our day-to-day life. And if I'm somebody, again, the whole thought of this is like, if the premise is relationships, and I do want to be able to see Domina on the other side and like be able to engage with her as best as I can to get a vibe and see, can I engage in a relationship with this person that's going to yield an amazing business results, right? And so back to Madison's point, like, focus on the internal workings of the structures you might have that could potentially be maximizing your biases. That's where the work needs to be done. And that's what I was going to say earlier. And I think around why diversity programs fail and why some of these trainings and these capabilities to mitigate biases fail is because it's not a one and done. This takes constant work. It's very similar to the whole idea of working out, right? You're not going to work out once and walk out of the gym looking like Beyonce. I wish. This is not how it happens. It takes constant repetitions and it takes constant inputs and work. It's the same thing with exercising to mitigate biases that could be oppressing people.
You brought up an interesting point, Lizzie. Why do diversity programs fail? And I want to double click on that a little bit. So Madison, what's been, could you talk about what's been your experiences? I would think that everybody today wants to do something with diversity and inclusion, but only few are really successful in solving the problem. What are the common pitfalls that one could face?
So I live in the startup land, and so often diversity and inclusion programs are done to impress the board and investors versus trying to actually change your organization. And so too often you have people at the bottom who want to do the work and people at the top who are just trying to put on a show, and there's no connection between the two. And so people who are doing it as a PR move or to look good on social media and Instagram and to their board aren't actually doing the work that needs to be done, because all of these programs and the program needs to have buy-in from your CEO all the way down. And so if that's not happening, no matter how many people who are individual contributors want to do the work and are willing to put it in, they can't actually make the change because they don't have the ability to make those decisions. And so I think a lot of the pitfalls happen is when it's more of like a smoke and mirror show to be able to say you're diverse and hit these numbers, but it's really kind of gamified.
So having an org-wide buy-in top down is very, very important. So with that, we're almost towards the end of our discussion. I know we're top of the hour, so I'll keep it very quick. One final question, and this is for you, Domina and Carl. What do you think are the predictions for tech diversity in 5 years, 10 years? What's going to change? And it's fairly open-ended, but any perspective on that would be insightful.
You want to go, Domina, or do you want me to go?
Yeah, I've been thinking on this one, and I hope what's going on in the world right now, and like with Black Lives Matter, and I hope that this fires people up to drive change, and not just in like recruiting and tech, but the whole world. I hope that this is like the pivotal point where more people start being aware of privilege and bias, take the time to educate, and actually lean in and do the work like Madison was talking about. Because especially like, I know our audience primarily right now is recruiters, and I truly feel like it's our responsibility. I think somebody referred to us as gatekeepers. It's true. It's our responsibility to reduce bias, to make sure that we have slates and make things, level the playing field, make it equitable, and advocate for diverse candidates, and change minds of hiring managers and leaders. And so not only that we're hiring diverse candidates, but they're successful and they feel like they belong and they have a growth path. So I just think that our role as recruiters is so important to that, and I hope that this fires people up to change. But that's my hope. It's not really a prediction, but I really hope it happens.
Carl?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of looking at it from a different angle when I respond here. I think what I see happening is like there's going to be more like within internal companies, like more programming and workshopping around like what does it mean to build like an inclusive team and an inclusive environment. It's one thing to have diversity, but how do we make them feel like they actually are belonging in this environment come day one? So more training like around onboarding and orientation. That's more part of like, this is how we are bringing new hires into our company. I don't know what kind of a cadence, but like more than just like the annual unconscious bias training, but like developing more curriculum around that. I'm talking like more of like the medium and like bigger size companies that have like the resources to do this. But I implore smaller companies to be able to do that for, being able to maybe work with, and this leads me to my second point, is like more external organizations coming in, helping to workshop. There's a number of great ones like Paradigm IQ, which does like a lot of data-driven strategies around unconscious bias training. Companies like Ready Set that do like diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting. Blendor does like augmented intelligence and people analytics to help you hire. Like there's a number of different like organizations and consulting businesses that can come in and help you if you're like too small, or maybe you are established and you want an outside opinion. I think there's going to be more of an emergence of that. And what I think will also happen is that you're going to see a lot more people of color, not only coming at the individual contributor level, but more like at the C-suite and at the board level. I think that we're starting to see a little bit of a push there. And I think it's very important at the board level. We just talked about that. Like as far as like we're trying to impress the board, well, let's have some people of color in the boardroom. So I know like in the past 2 weeks, we've had like Michael Siebel just joined the Reddit board after Alex Ohanian decided to remove himself from it. We've had Tristan Walker, who created Bevel. He's now on the board of Shake Shack, and he was previously on the board of Foot Locker. So he's on 2 boards. Stacey Brown Philpott, who was the CEO of TaskRabbit, is on the board at HP and at Nordstrom. So seeing more people of color emerge, I think is something that you're going to see more of. And just as a one-off, not related to tech, but like I know that here in the Bay Area, Sally Grimes, she's an Indian American woman. She's now the CEO of Cliff Bar, so more like in the consumer packaged goods sector. You're going to see more people of color starting to emerge as people, I hope, become more conscious of what's happening in our country and within our business ecosystem. And so that's my prediction. And so I hope that that's a continuing trend upward.
Go ahead, Madison.
And I think the other thing is, speaking to Carl's point of doing these trainings, I think the trainings need to be like, so I think we all kind of do them once a year, and it's like this thing that you do and you're out of work for an hour, and how many people in a room full of 100 are actually focused? Probably not all of them. And so I really believe that we need to actually meet with teams individually, because every team should have a very different lens for DEI and what that means to their exact team. I don't look at DEI the same way a software engineer should be looking at DEI. They need to be building an inclusive product. Well, I need to be making sure that I'm inclusive in my hiring practices. And I think too often we miss the mark on the ability to actually give teams actionable items.
Lissy, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, when I think about the future state of our tech sector, I really think about the future state of our social environments, because I make the case that our social environments inevitably then dictate where our businesses and then our tech sectors go. And my optimism is going to show here just a little bit, but bear with me. Madison said something earlier that really stood out to me about organizations that stand up these smoke and mirrors DEI initiatives because they don't want to get caught with their pants down. And I think as we head into this next wave of a future state of DE&I in tech, we have got to, as thought leaders and as champions and as workplace activists, come in with a level of grace and a level of compassion, as hard as it might be, because we can look at our social systems and say, yo, we've been at this for hundreds of years and we're not seeing a change. I'm done. I'm kicking down those smoke and mirrors. I think organizations put those up because of nerves and out of fear base. And so they don't ever get anything done, and it takes them a long time. And I think because we've got a high level of cancel culture right now in our social systems, and I think we are going to have to remove those, as hard as it might be and as frustrating as it may be, because I too am annoyed and I too have a low level of patience for some organizations. But when we look at the tech sector specifically and the demographics of our tech sector, we have to come up with a lot of patience and a lot of compassion, because these smoke and mirrors are up out of fear, because organizations are afraid of getting canceled. So if we can lean through that a little bit and help them put in strategies and help them put in equitable strategies that rise, to Carl's point, people of color at the C-level, that help people come in at the organization at the entry point that may have historically be underrepresented, that's when we start to make change, is when we do it truly with some compassion, some grace, and just a little bit of that human to human piece first.
Very humane point, Lissy, that, while the problem frustrates all of us, we've got to take a compassionate approach, because the reason the problem exists at some subliminal level, there is a fear, human fear that's playing into it. So we've got to be patient and compassionate. So guys, I have absolutely enjoyed hosting this panel today. Very interesting perspectives, really loved opinions coming from all of you guys, and I'm sure the audience loved it. I know we are already like 8 minutes above, so I'm not gonna drag it any further. We had tons of questions. I regret we couldn't take them up because of we ourselves are having so much fun talking. But what we'll probably do is we'll compile some of these questions and put it across to you guys, and then figure out a way to address it to the people who had asked. Just to summarize some of the key learnings for me today, one has to be very intentional and conscious about this whole thing. Change and buy-in needs to start from the top. Processes, there are tons of processes that one could put in place, and I think there's enough literature and consulting firms out there who can help you do it. But until and unless there is a real personal intent at the hiring manager level to say, I'm going to be inclusive, I'm going to hire people who add to my culture, and I'm going to do something about it, we will not be able to institute that change at an organization-wide level. And we as the recruiting community play a very, very important role. Like we've said, we are the gatekeepers here. We are the ones who are going to go back and stand up to our hiring managers and push them, nudge them, and create an impact. So power to all of us and all the people in the audience today. Thanks a lot for being on the session today. Really enjoyed the conversation. Have a good rest of the day ahead. For the audience, guys, please feel free to give in your perspective. If you liked it, please give your opinions. Tag all of us on social media. You have our handles. We need to talk about this as much as we can.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, guys. Bye. So that's it. That brings an end to our panel discussion today on removing biases in hiring. I'm sorry we couldn't take up the questions, but like I said, we'll take up these questions. We will try and get you the answers either through social media or through direct email. Thanks a lot for being on the panel discussion today. I hope you guys enjoyed it and have a good rest of the day ahead.